He died with his eyes open. Not with that peace often described in beautiful stories, not with a smile of enlightenment, nor with a peaceful expression on his face. As if the man had simply fallen asleep and never woke up again. His face was contorted by something far more frightening than pain. There was neither fear nor despair on it. Only one emotion was written there, the horror of realization. The pure, primal terror of one who has suddenly understood something that can no longer be unlearned or forgotten. The nurse on duty that night recounted that his last words were barely audible. The old man's voice trembled, as if he were not speaking simple phrases, but a sentence for himself. I thought everything was just a dream. All my life I was sure it was a dream and that when I woke up, everything would change. But I was wrong. Now it is too late. Too late. Then his heart stopped. The doctors tried to save him. Resuscitation, adrenaline, electric shocks. It was all in vain. His heart did not want to beat again. And perhaps it was an act of mercy. Perhaps, after what he had learned, returning would have been torture. This man's name was Evgeny Liventsev, a Soviet general, a military scientist, a man who had worked all his life with facts, with calculations, with iron logic. A rational, tough, confident man who survived the war, survived political waves, survived the collapse of the state. He had seen much in his life and believed that nothing could shake him anymore. And then his body betrayed his mind. A stroke, a sudden, unexpected blow from a blood vessel in the brain. The man collapsed, losing consciousness. The doctors gave him 9 days, no more. The medical board decided almost unanimously that this was the end. The brain processes were irreversible. His brain was dying. Even if he survived that night, he would be a vegetable, unable to speak, move, or think. His family began to say their goodbyes, but on the 9th day, the impossible happened. The general opened his eyes. The nurse, checking his condition, screamed. Doctors rushed into the room thinking they were hallucinating. But no, Liventsev was conscious, and not just conscious, but in full possession of his mental faculties. He could speak, he could move, he could recognize people. All his cognitive functions were normal, a medical miracle. In the history of medicine, there have been cases of spontaneous recovery, but such cases are singular occurrences every few centuries. The doctors could not explain how it happened. The tomographs showed that the brain was still damaged, but for some reason, it had started to work. Liventsev was alive. Moreover, he was absolutely healthy. And so, on the first night after waking up, he asked for paper and a pencil. The nurse brought him a school notebook and an ordinary pencil. The old general's hand trembled, but he began to write. He wrote all day, he wrote all night. He wrote with such intensity, as if an ocean of information had been unleashed inside him, demanding to come to the surface. The doctors wanted to stop him, fearing that the effort would hinder his recovery, but Liventsev listened to no one. He wrote, and wrote. On the 3rd day, they invited a psychiatrist. They were sure the stroke had affected his psyche, that the general was going through a post-stroke psychosis, hallucinations, delirium. But when they read his notes, their skepticism began to crumble, because there was no delirium in his words. There was a structure, there was logic, there was a system that a man in a psychological crisis would not have been capable of inventing. There was a truth that was too convincing to be a fabrication. The general described what he had seen in those days when his body lay in a coma and his consciousness was elsewhere, and these descriptions were so detailed, so clear, so frightening, that the doctors, one by one, began to leave the hospital, unable to bear what they were reading. Oh, because in his notes there was information that should not have been known to anyone. Information about what awaits us after death. Information about what really happens to our soul. Information about the fact that civilization stands on the edge of the abyss and is already ready to fall. They feared publishing these notes. They hid them. They concealed them. They passed from hand to hand like contraband goods. And anyone who read them understood why they had to be kept silent, because after reading them, you can no longer live as you lived before. Because these notes change everything. And if you are ready to learn the truth, If you are ready to look in the face of what hides behind the curtain of our reality, then stay with us until the end. Because now you will hear what only a few have heard. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next part, because this is just the beginning. It is just the opening of the door to the room where the answers to questions humanity has feared to ask for thousands of years are kept. Welcome to the investigation that will change you forever. To understand the magnitude of what will happen next, you must know who Evgeny Liventsev really was. He was not just an old man who fell ill and healed. He was a man whose life was literally inscribed in the fabric of Soviet history. Born in the year 1931, he survived the blockade of Leningrad. In childhood, saw the war as a young officer, then built a career as a military scientist, working on projects that are still classified today. The general was a man of logic, of pure and cold logic. His mind worked like clockwork. Every thought had a cause. Every hypothesis was verified by facts. Religion never attracted him. Mysticism seemed like foolishness to an educated man. Even at an advanced age, lying on the hospital bed, he continued to believe only in what could be seen, touched, and measured. His doctors knew this about him. That is why, when in October 1989 the general fell, what happened was something no one expected. Liventsev was already at an advanced age. His blood pressure gave him trouble. His blood sugar fluctuated. All signs that the human body begins to fail. A blood vessel in the left hemisphere of his brain burst at 7 o'clock in the morning. His wife found him. He was lying on the kitchen floor. His left side was completely paralyzed. His mouth twisted, his eyes glassy. The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes. The doctors said they barely made it. A few more minutes, and his brain would have been completely dead. At the hospital, procedures began. IVs, injections, inhalations. The brain was swelling. Doctors administered drugs to reduce the edema. They induced Liventsev into a pharmacological coma so that his brain would receive a chance to recover. The equipment beeped. Monitors showed barely perceptible waves of activity. On the third day, the medical council met in the chief physician's office. The head neurologist, Dr. Sergei Molchanov, unrolled the images from the tomograph. On the black background, the area of the brain where the hemorrhage had occurred lit up. It was not a small stroke, it was a catastrophe. The affected area was huge. It touched areas responsible for speech, movement, memory, cognitive functions. If he wakes up, he will no longer be a human in the usual sense of the word, Molchanov said, pointing to the reddish spots of the lesion. His brain is dead. We are fighting with a corpse. To maintain life in such a state is not a miracle. It is a crime against his human dignity. Liventsev's wife, Maria Ilyinichna, agreed with him. She herself was a doctor, a neurosurgeon, and knew medicine better than most. She agreed to disconnect the machines in a week if there were no improvements. This was a pact between her and her husband, made when they were both young and believed that death was something distant and abstract. The 7th day arrived. Maria Ilyinichna came to the room at 7 o'clock in the morning. Nurse Zina was just starting her shift. They were preparing for what medicine calls the natural end of life. It sounds nicer than death, but it means the same thing. Zina checked the sensors. The pulse was barely perceptible. Breathing was supported by the machine. Brain activity was at the level of a plant. The doctor said this is no longer a man. It is just a collection of organs that still function. And then it happened. The general suddenly opened his eyes. Not gradually, not slowly, but suddenly, in a single movement, as if someone had pressed a switch. His pupils were clear, clearer than they had been for a week. His head turned toward his wife, and his eyes met hers. In them was such intensity, such light, that Maria Ilyinichna screamed. "Mother?" whispered Zina. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The doctors ran into the room in 1 minute. They began the check, the neurological hammer, the light in the eyes, questions. "Do you hear me? How many fingers are on the hand? What is your name?" Liventsev answered everything, clearly, distinctly, correctly. The tomography was redone. In the images, everything was as bad as before. The area of the lesion remained in place. but the brain was working, functions were restored. It was impossible, but it was happening. "It is a medical miracle," Molchanov said, looking at the images, then at the living and conscious general in the room. "In 50 years of career, I have not seen anything like this." News of this miracle spread quickly through the hospital, then through the city, then through the whole country. Newspapers wrote about the miracle, journalists came, doctors gave interviews. It was a scientific sensation. A man who was supposed to die recovered completely. But Liventsev was not at all delighted with this attention. On the second day after waking up, when the doctors finished the examination and stopped coming with their machines, the general asked for paper and pencil. "I must write what I remember," he said quietly, almost agonizingly. "I must tell this while I am here, while I am alive, because after what I saw, I understand that life is no longer necessary to me. Only the truth is necessary, just that." Nurse Zina brought the notebook and pencil. Liventsev's hand was weak, but he began to write, word by word, line by line. His handwriting became more and more sure, as if someone else was guiding his hand, as if he were merely an instrument through which information flowed from an external source. The doctors wanted to stop him, but his wife, Maria Ilyinichna, stood up and placed herself between Liventsev and the doctors. "Let him write," she said. Her voice was absolutely firm. "He went through something. He returned here, not without reason. Let him write." The general wrote for hours on end. On the third day, the psychiatrists visited him. They were sure they were dealing with a post-stroke psychosis. The general is having hallucinations, remembering dreams, taking them for reality. But when they began to read his notes, their certainty began to waver, because in his words there was such logic, such structuring, such persuasive power, which a psyche traumatized by brain injury could not create. He was not describing random images. He was describing a cosmic system, a divine system, which governs the destiny of every human life. And the strangest thing was that his descriptions corresponded with ancient texts, with Eastern philosophy, with religious traditions, as if he had passed through a timeless library of knowledge containing the wisdom of all times and all cultures. "It is impossible," whispered one of the psychiatrists. "This simply cannot be." But it was. General Evgeny Liventsev, materialist, rationalist, Soviet officer, returned from death not with symptoms of psychosis, but with a message. And this message was addressed to all of humanity. The hardest thing in what happened to General Liventsev was to explain it in words, because what he saw in those days did not fit into human language. Language is created to describe the material world. Tables, chairs, people, events. But when one must describe what lies beyond the boundaries of the material, language begins to break. Liventsev understood this. In his notes, he specifically stated, "Words are a prison for what I saw, but I will try nonetheless." Here is what he wrote. "I cannot say I was in a place, because that was not a place. Space exists because there is distance between objects. There was neither distance nor objects in the sense I understood them. There was only awareness, a direct, pure awareness. I existed, but my mind was not limited by a body. I could know everything that needed to be known just by thinking about it. Thought and reality were one and the same." Nurse Zina, who read his notes, said that shivers went down her spine when she read that, as if the general was describing something that was outside her understanding, but at the same time absolutely real. "And then I met him," Liventsev continued. "I cannot call him a being. I cannot say he was a man or an animal or energy or anything else. He was an ancient reason, an incredibly ancient reason. When I met him, I felt that this being sees every deed of mine, every thought of mine, every moment of my life. He saw me completely, without filters, without excuses, without lies. And the strangest thing was that I felt no judgment. I felt no condemnation. I felt only understanding. This rational being knew me better than I knew myself." The doctors listened, and each of them had a few explanations. Hallucination, archetypal image from the collective unconscious, a subconscious construction of his own mind. But Liventsev answered this the same way. "I know the difference between imagination and reality. I have lived long enough to understand that. What I saw was more real than the reality in which I live now. And then the message came. "This being spoke to me without words," wrote the general. "I simply knew what he wanted to convey to me. He told me, 'Do you remember why you were born? Do you remember what you agreed to before descending into the material world?' I remembered. I remember it now as I write these words. I remember that I agreed to be born to remember what people have forgotten, to remember that there is life after death, to remember that every human is not just a body that lives a few tens of years and then decomposes into atoms. Every human is an eternal consciousness, temporarily wearing the mask of a material being, and people have forgotten about this. They have forgotten completely." The notes continued, "And then this being told me, 'You will return on the 9th day. You will return to your body. You will live a little longer, and you must tell people the truth. This is your task. This is the reason for your return. People have forgotten why they live, and are heading towards the abyss. They have forgotten about the soul. They have forgotten about eternity. They live like animals, only for food, for money, for television. And when they die, they pass through the horror of realizing that they wasted an eternity on nothing. You must wake them up. At least a few people must hear the truth." And on the 3rd day after waking up, Liventsev asked for a psychologist. He wanted to make sure that his mind was in perfect order, that this was not a psychosis, that he really was where he believes he was. "I do not believe what I write," said the general with sadness in his voice. "That is the most terrible thing. I am a logician. I am a scientist. I spent my whole life believing only in facts. And now my mind tells me that I was in another place. I met another consciousness. I received a message. But another part of my mind says it is impossible, that it is just a dream that the brain created during the coma, that it is a hallucination conditioned by brain damage. I need to know what is happening to me." The psychologist conducted a series of tests. The general passed them perfectly. His memory was normal, his logic was normal, his perception was normal. Psychologically, Liventsev was completely healthy. "Perhaps it was," said the psychologist, almost lost. "Perhaps you really were in that place. Perhaps your mind saw what material eyes cannot see." But Liventsev shook his head. "I do not believe in that. I cannot allow myself to believe in that, because if I start believing in the supernatural, in magic, in the afterlife, then my mind will collapse. I need logic, I need rationality. But perhaps precisely therein lies the mediation. Perhaps this being knew I would not believe if he spoke to me like a mystic. That is why he offered me logic. He showed me a system that works in accordance with laws I can understand." In his notes, a system began to manifest. A system in which every human life is a project launched by a higher consciousness. A system in which every human has what Liventsev called a guide. A subtle energetic structure that is linked to our soul and helps us orient ourselves in life. "The guide is the voice of intuition," wrote the general. "It is the inner voice that tells us what is right and what is wrong. It is the feeling of danger that makes us avoid misfortune. It is the inspiration of artists, the spark of scientists. All these are the guide. But people have stopped listening to the guide. Too much noise, too much information, too many distractions. And that is why people get lost. They take the wrong path. They create situations that cause them pain, and they do not understand why this happens, because they do not hear the voice trying to guide them." The doctors reading these notes began to notice a strangeness. Liventsev described events from the lives of other people he had never met. He described with precision events that were to happen in the future. The descriptions of his messages became more and more complex and profound. "It seems to me that the hand writes by itself," Maria Ilyinichna told the doctors. "Look at his face. This is the face of a man who does not control what he writes. It is the face of a transmitter, not a writer." And indeed, when the general wrote, the expression on his face changed. It was as if he entered a trance state. His eyes became empty, his breathing slowed, and his hand wrote. Word by word, image by image, revelation by revelation. In one of the notes, Liventsev described the meeting with his own life, as if time in that place flowed differently, and he could see every moment of his life. The young officer, the scholar husband, the father, everything in simultaneity. "I understood that life is not a line from birth to death," he wrote. "Life is a sphere, an eternal sphere, in which every moment exists eternally. And death is just a passage from one part of this sphere to another. Nothing ends, everything continues. And if I lived well, with honor, with kindness, then I will continue to live, but in another place, in another form. And if I lived badly, if I caused pain to others, if I lived in lies, then I will live the results of my actions in another place." This was the beginning of the revelation about the structure of the afterlife that awaits every human. On the 5th day after waking up, Liventsev finished his notes on the meeting with the other world and moved on to the most important thing, the system. "I must tell about what happens after death," wrote the general, and his writing was more sure, clearer than before. "Not in metaphors, not in religious images, but describing what I saw with my own eyes." The doctors gathered in the chief physician's office to read what followed. Liventsev described 3 directions, 3 paths that await the human soul after death. The first path, the orbit of souls. "This is the place where those who lived wrongly arrive," wrote the general. "Not those who committed direct crimes, but those who lived in denial. Those who caused pain to others for their own gain. Those who betrayed. Those who lived in total selfishness. And this place is not fire. There are no demons. It is not that type of hell described in religious texts. It is a place of realization." In the document, Liventsev explained that in the orbit of souls, every human lives the results of their actions, but not as a punishment, but as a direct experience. "If you caused pain to a person in life, then in the orbit you live that pain from their point of view," described the general. "You understand how much it hurt them. You feel their despair. You go through all the emotions they went through because of your actions, and this continues until you completely understand the consequences of your deeds." The doctors were reading this, and one of them, Dr. Molchanov, said, "This is the description of consciousness at an absolute level. It is not supernatural, it is logical. If man could fully realize the pain he caused, he would change." But in Liventsev's notes, there was something else about the orbit. "In the end, the soul can choose total disappearance," wrote the general, and the doctors froze reading this. "If the pain of realization becomes unbearable, if the man cannot accept what he has done, his consciousness can simply dissolve, can cease to exist. This is the second death, and this is the final one. The second path, the abode of purification. This is the place for those who lived with an open heart," continued Liventsev. "Not for saints, not for ideal people. For people who lived honestly, who tried to do good, even if they didn't always succeed. Who made mistakes but admitted them. Who loved others more than they loved themselves. In the abode of purification, according to the general's description, the human soul goes through a healing process. Here there is no pain, no suffering, only silence and understanding. In the abode you see your mistakes, but without guilt," wrote Liventsov. "You understand where you strayed from the path, but you understand this with gentleness, with compassion for yourself. Here you are taught forgiveness. Forgiveness of others, and most importantly, self-forgiveness. And then, when you are ready, you either remain in the abode, in eternal silence, or you take a new life in the material world to continue your path of evolution. The third path, the energy double and the memory of all lives." This was the most complicated part of Liventsov's notes. "Every human creates an energy double at birth," described the general. "This is a copy of your consciousness, but it does not live in your body. It exists on another plane of reality. This double keeps information about every deed of yours, every thought of yours, every feeling of yours. After the death of your physical body, this double arrives in the field of memory of all lives." The doctors stopped when they read this. It sounded like the description of a quantum computer recording information in the universe. "The memory field is a global repository of the experience of all living beings that have ever lived." The general continued to write, "This is not a place, but rather a structure. The structure of the consciousness of the universe itself. And when your life ends, your double brings its experience into this field, and all of humanity, all beings that have ever existed, receive information about your life. You become part of the whole. Then Liventsov described the entity that helps every human orient themselves in this labyrinth of death and life. The guide. The guide is a subtle energy structure, linked to your soul, wrote the general. It exists from the moment of your birth. It knows where you are going, what you must do to fulfill the task for which you were born. The guide constantly sends signals. This is intuition. These are dreams. These are those meetings that seem accidental but in fact are not. It is the voice inside that says, "It is not good. Turn back. Good. Continue in this direction." But Liventsov also wrote about the fact that people have stopped listening to their guides. The modern world is full of noise, he explained. Television, the internet, mobile phones, advertisements, surrounding people, cars, constant information, constant stimulation. And in this noise, the guide's voice becomes inaudible. People no longer feel intuition. They no longer see signs. They act chaotically, without direction, because they have disconnected the only instrument that could have helped them. The doctors began to observe a pattern. Liventsov described historical figures and their connection to guides. Mendeleev saw the periodic table in a dream, wrote the general. But it was not just a dream. It was a direct transmission of information from his guide. Edison, Tesla, the great poets, the artists, all had access to the source of knowledge that lies beyond the limits of the material world, because they developed their ability to listen. They cleared their minds of noise to hear the voice of the guide. And then Liventsov made a statement that shook the doctors. "I was wrong," wrote the general. "I lived almost my whole life believing I was sure of myself, that I knew the truth, that I was a materialist and a rationalist. I was wrong. Materialism is the main mistake of my time. We created a civilization based on an erroneous philosophy. We said that matter is all that exists, but matter is just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond matter lies energy. Beyond energy lies information. Beyond information lies consciousness. And consciousness is everything. It is the primary cause of everything that exists." On the seventh day, Liventsov finished writing about the structure of the world beyond. The doctors gathered all his notes, copied them, and began distributing them among close and trusted colleagues. No one dared to publish this openly. It was too dangerous, too controversial, too capable of overturning everything humanity knew about death and life. But one night, while Liventsov was sleeping, his heart stopped beating. Not because he was sick. The doctors said later that it was a heart attack, but in fact, his heart was fine. It was something else. It was as if he had decided that his mission was over. He returned, told what needed to be told, and now he was ready to move on. Maria Ilyinichna found her husband cold but with a smile on his lips. He seemed peaceful, she told the doctors, as if he knew this would happen, as if he was waiting for this moment. At the funeral, his notes began to spread, carefully, cautiously, from hand to hand. Those who read understood they were holding something holy in their hands. A revelation from a man who died and returned to tell the truth. After Liventsov's death, his notes began to spread through the country. People shared them, copied them, rewrote them by hand, sent them via letters. This happened before the internet. That is why information spread slower, but relentlessly. And anyone who read these notes faced a choice, to believe or not to believe. But fear was greater than doubt, because if these notes are true, then the life that every human lives, that each of us lives, is built on a foundation of lies. But there is another part of Liventsov's history, a part that was written by his wife, Maria Ilyinichna, already after his death. A part that explains why the general specifically was chosen, and why his message is addressed specifically to us, the people of the 21st century, in the century of digital technologies, when man has definitively broken away from nature, from intuition, from his own soul. Maria Ilyinichna was a doctor, as we already know, but she wasn't just a doctor, she was a clairvoyant, and this was her main secret, which she hid all her life. Her gift began in childhood. Little Maria, at 5 years old, saw how people glowed in different colors. She saw the aura of every person, the colors surrounding the body. She saw when a person is sick, even before the disease manifested physically. She saw the future in dreams. She saw when a misfortune awaited a person and tried to warn them. But no one believed the little girl. Her parents thought she had an imagination. Her teachers considered her strange. And only at school when she saved her classmate's life, warning him not to leave the house on a certain day because she had seen that danger awaited him. Only then did people begin to notice that something was wrong. In the Soviet period, clairvoyance was considered anti-scientific. It was something from the age of superstitions, from the times when people believed in witches and demons. The Soviet man believed in progress, in science, in materialism. That is why Maria Ilyinichna hid her gift. She became a doctor, following the family logic. But she kept her abilities secret. She hid. Her colleagues knew something was wrong with her, that she possessed an elusive intuition. But they didn't speak about it out loud because it was dangerous. Her patients knew. People came to her not only because she was a good doctor, although she was. People came because she saw what many do not see. She looked at a person and knew what was inside. She knew where the pain was, she knew where it came from. And then she could help not only with medicine, but with understanding, with knowledge, with truth. Yevgeny Liventsev met her at a conference. He was a general, she was a doctor, he was a materialist, she was something else. But when they started talking, he understood that he had met a person who knows something he doesn't. And that scared him, because Liventsev was sure of himself, of his knowledge about the world, of his logic. And Maria Ilyinichna looked at him as if she saw through him, as if she knew his every mistake, every fear, every secret. But with time, he loved her. He loved her not only for her mind and beauty, but also for her ability to see. Her gift scared him at first. The materialist didn't believe in clairvoyance, but with time, he became a witness to her predictions, her intuition, her knowledge about what would follow. And he understood that Maria sees reality more clearly than he does. Despite all his logical proofs, despite all his textbooks and devices, their life was a strange combination of skepticism and mysticism. She wrote a supplement to her husband's notes, and in this supplement, she revealed what she had known for a lifetime. "My husband was not chosen by chance," she wrote. "He was chosen because he was a skeptic, because if the message had come to me, to a person who always believed in the invisible world, it would have been easy for people to reject it. People would have said, it is the hallucination of a mystic, the result of her imagination, of her faith. But the message came to a materialist, to a logician, to a scientist, to a general, to a man who swore that nothing supernatural exists, to a man who laughed at religion and faith. And this man was forced to acknowledge the reality of what he saw. His skepticism became the protection of this message, protection against accusations of irrationality, protection against attempts to dismiss the truth as fiction." Maria Ilyinichna described other people who had similar gifts as well. "People who see more than others see often have the ability the world calls clairvoyance or premonition," she wrote. "But few understand what this really is. It is not a gift, as many believe, especially those who envy not having this gift. It is a burden, a heavy, unbearable burden, a physical, psychological, and spiritual burden that tears a person to pieces. Because when you see the truth about the world, when you see how people suffer, when you see how they head towards mistakes, when you see the future and know what awaits humanity, this breaks your soul. It literally breaks your body. You start getting sick, you start getting exhausted, your energy drains and you become more fragile, weaker, more vulnerable." And then Maria Ilyinichna told a story that was even more frightening than Liventsov's notes. A story that was never written in textbooks, that was forgotten by time, but which demonstrates the price of the gift. "There was a woman I knew personally. Her name was Elena. She lived in Leningrad. She had a strong gift of clairvoyance. Her gift was stronger than mine. She could see people's past lives. She could see their future accurately, down to the details. She could see the diseases that would catch up with a person. She knew which people would be important to him. She saw their vocation, path, everything. And she was young, full of hope. She believed she could help people. She told them what she saw, told them what they had to do, warned them about dangers. But people didn't listen. They denied. They said she was crazy, that she was sick, that it was quackery. They laughed at her, persecuted her, fired her from work, ridiculed her in newspapers. The authorities followed her because it was considered activity against the state, and the more she tried to help, the more she invested her energy, life in attempts to save people, the more exhausted she became, continued Maria Ilyinichna. Literally, her body began to fail. She developed anemia, she had chronic depression, she didn't even have the strength to get out of bed. Her immune system collapsed. She was only 43 years old when she simply ceased to be. Her heart stopped. Doctors said it was a heart attack, that her heart didn't withstand the effort. But I know the truth. The truth is that she simply refused to live anymore. Her gift, which should have been a blessing, became her curse because people didn't want to listen. And when a person who has a gift sees that people are heading towards self-destruction, that they deny the truth, that they reject salvation, this kills him. It is a slow, agonizing self-destruction. Elena was the victim not of enemies, but of misunderstanding. Of misunderstanding of what she knows, of what she sees, of what she is trying to say. Maria Ilyinichna sketched the portrait of the person with a gift as society sees him. In society, people who have the gift of clairvoyance are often perceived as a threat or as scammers, she wrote, because people fear what they do not understand. They fear the fact that someone can see their secrets, weaknesses, their true nature. This causes fear. And that is why people attack those who have the gift. They call them wizards, witches, possessed. They ask authorities to persecute them. They try to stay silent, to hide their abilities, because if they came to light, society would destroy them. This has been the history for millennia, from the Inquisition to the Soviet period. People with a gift have always been victims, because they saw what they shouldn't see, because they told the truth people didn't want to hear. And then, in Maria Ilyinichna's notes, the main warning appeared. The gift closes if it is used incorrectly, she wrote. And this was the most important thing she ever wrote. If a person who has the ability to see uses this ability for fame, for money, for power over others, for satisfying their own ego, their gift disappears. The contact channel closes, and then they remain alone in the dark, without connection to that source from which they took the truth. Their gift becomes a curse, because they remember they could see, but now they have gone blind. And this blindness is more painful than if they had never had the gift. I saw people who used their gift for money, who created a cult around them, who deceived people. And what happened to them? They went mad. They lost their ability to see. They remained in the void. This was their payment for the incorrect use of the gift. This was a warning for those who will receive Liventsov's notes and will try to use them for their own gain. They will try to create a cult, to create a sect. They will try to manipulate people using this information. But the main warning concerned humanity itself. Yevgeny told me before death what he didn't write in his notes, Maria Ilyinichna recounted. We were lying next to each other, and he was holding my hand, and his voice could barely be heard. But I heard every word. He said that higher consciousness he met showed him the history of civilization. Not one, but a multitude. Tens, hundreds of civilizations that developed in the universe. And everything happened according to the same scenario, as if it were a law of nature, an inevitable process that repeats again and again. The scenario was the following, she continued. Rational beings develop. They start from the primitive state. They learn to use fire, to create tools, to build houses. Then they develop writing, develop art and philosophy. They begin to ask questions about the meaning of life. They create religion, morality, ethics. They understand that there is something more than themselves. But then they forget about it. They create technology, accumulate material wealth, become self-absorbed. And at this moment, the turning point occurs. They begin to forget they are rational. They become consumers. They live only for the pleasure of the body, for food, for sex, for entertainment. They forget about the soul. They forget about the meaning of life. They forget that they agreed to be born specifically in this time for a specific purpose. And when this happens, when the majority of civilizations forget about the soul, the collapse begins, the fall begins, Everything they created collapses. Society falls apart. People suffer. There is war, famine, disease. And the majority of these civilizations disappear from the face of the cosmos. They become ruins. Maybe in 1 million years another race will find their remains, and guess what was? What happened to the people who lived here? Why they disappeared? And we are in this moment right now, proclaimed Maria Ilyinichna. And her voice, in the imagination of the people reading her words, seemed prophetic. Right now, at the end of the 20th century, when the world is full of technology, when everyone has a television, when people have forgotten how to enjoy each other, when they have forgotten how to listen to their intuition, when they have transformed into consumers, living only for work and goods, for money and cars and clothes, we are at a critical point. This is the last possibility to wake up. This is the last call. This is the last chance. If people do not start to change their life, if they do not start to listen to the voice of their soul, if they do not start to live with a true meaning, if they do not start to remember the fact that they came to this earth not for money, but for something greater, then the collapse is inevitable. It cannot be stopped. It is inevitable. And then Maria Ilyinichna made a call addressed to everyone who will read these words. Don't take our word for it, she wrote. And this was the most important thing she could say. Don't believe. Verify yourselves, feel yourselves. Ask yourselves the question, why do I live? Not in words, not in philosophy, but in a deep sensation. Why do I need this life? Why do I wake up every day? Why do I go to work? Why do I earn money? If you cannot answer this question, if you feel a void, if you feel something is wrong, that something doesn't fit, then this is a sign. It is a signal from your guide. It is the voice of your soul saying you have forgotten the main thing. And if you hear this voice, start changing your life. Not tomorrow, not next year. Start today. Now. Start listening to intuition. Start living not for material things, but for meaning. For truth. For love. For the connection with other people. To leave this world better than you found it. And Maria Ilyinichna's final call was simple, and at the same time, revolutionary. If you read these notes and feel that there is truth in them, that your intuition tells you this is not simply a fabrication, then do not remain silent. Do not hide this sign. Speak about it. Share this. Tell your family. Tell your friends. Tell strangers, if that is what your soul whispers to you. Because every person who wakes up, every person who starts living with meaning, is a wave spreading through the world. And maybe, if enough people wake up simultaneously, if enough people remember why they live, then we will be able to stop the collapse. We will be able to save civilization. We will be able to create a world where people live with honor, with love, with a true meaning, and not in the void of consumption. I lived the life of a skeptic, wrote Liventsov in one of his last notes. I died as a skeptic. I still did not allow myself to fully believe in everything I saw, and maybe that is good. Maybe that protects you, the people who will read these notes. You do not have to believe me. You do not have to believe my wife. You do not have to blindly believe someone else. You have to verify yourselves. You have to listen to your inner voice, because your voice is your very guide, your intuition, your soul that knows the truth. And if your soul tells you that this is the truth, then it is the truth. Regardless of what textbooks say, regardless of what science says, regardless of what society says, your intuition does not lie. Listen to it. And the last thing I want to say, concluded Maria Ilyinichna, and her words sounded like a testament, like a message from another world. If you are watching this video now, if you are reading these notes, if you reach the end of this message, this is not an accident. It is not a coincidence. It was a choice. The choice of your guide. The choice of your higher essence. You were directed here because you are ready to hear this truth, and now you have a choice. You can close these notes, you can continue living how you lived before, immersed in the material world, in consumption, in the void, in the dream. Or you can start to change, start with a little. Meditate, listen to music that makes your soul happy. Walk in nature, where there are no cars and phones. Talk to people, talk for real, look them in the eyes. Do what makes your soul sing. Do what has meaning, even if that means losing money, losing status, losing what society considers success. Because true success is peace in the soul. It is the knowledge of the fact that you live for something greater. If you read these notes and feel that there is truth in them, write 3 words in the comments. I am still alive, not because you are physically alive, but because your soul still lives, because you are ready to wake up, because you start listening to the voice that is much stronger, much more important than all the noise of this world. This video material is based on spiritual and philosophical sources, as well as the author's interpretation. It does not represent the author's personal experience and is not a scientifically proven fact. All descriptions of mystical and spiritual phenomena must be perceived as part of spiritual and philosophical teaching, and not as medical or scientific information. In case of questions about health or psychological state, address specialists.